It all started as a fun trip. My friends Amar, Danielle, and I had been planning this getaway for months. A tropical island was waiting for us, and we couldn't have been more excited. The night before our flight, we stayed up talking about snorkeling, beach parties, and all the adventures we'd have. None of us knew this trip would turn into a nightmare. The flight was scheduled for 2 a.m., and the airport was unusually quiet. The faint hum of announcements echoed in the empty halls. Ahmad joked about how creepy it felt, but Danielle brushed it off. He always had a way of laughing at everything. Our flight, ZX917, was delayed. When the gate finally opened, only a few passengers boarded with us. The plane was old, much older than I'd expected. Its narrow aisles creaked underfoot, and the overhead lights flickered occasionally. The flight attendant, a tall woman with pale skin and an almost unnerving smile, greeted us in a voice that didn't feel warm or welcoming. "Welcome aboard," she said. "We'll be reaching our destination in 4 hours. ... If everything goes as planned, I frowned at her choice of words, but Amar nudged me with a grin. "Relax, it's just a flight." What could go wrong? Amar sat by the window, Danielle took the aisle, and I sat in the middle. I noticed something strange almost immediately. The plane wasn't full. There were barely 10 passengers, all scattered throughout the cabin. Most of them sat silently, staring out of the windows or straight ahead. Not a single smile or conversation among them. The engines roared, and the plane ascended into the dark night sky. At first, everything seemed normal. Danielle joked about the in-flight snacks. Amar pressed his face to the window, marveling at the clouds, and I tried to relax. But about 30 minutes into the flight, the temperature dropped. It wasn't a subtle change, it was sudden, sharp, like walking into a freezer. "Do you feel that?" I asked. Amar nodded, pulling his hoodie tighter around himself. "Maybe the AC's broken?" Danielle smirked. "Or maybe we're flying through ghost country." The lights flickered again, this time longer. When they stabilized, the flight attendant appeared at the end of the aisle, standing perfectly still. Her expression was blank, and her smile had vanished. "Everything okay?" Danielle called out. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the cockpit without a word. "Creepy," Amar whispered. We laughed nervously, but the unease lingered. Something about her demeanor chilled me to the bone. I tried to shake it off, but then the first scream pierced the silence. It came from a woman sitting a few rows ahead. She shot up from her seat, pointing at the window. "There's someone out there!" Everyone turned toward the windows, but all I could see was darkness. The woman wouldn't stop screaming until another passenger, a man in a suit, tried to calm her down. "It's just your imagination," he said. "No, I saw it," she insisted, her voice trembling. "A face pressed against the glass." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, but it wasn't reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We're experiencing some turbulence." The plane shook violently and Danielle grabbed the armrest. "That's not turbulence," he muttered. The lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness for a moment. When they came back on, the woman was gone. "Where did she go?" Amar whispered. "She was just there," I said, my voice shaking. The man in the suit stood up, looking around. She probably went to the restroom, but something felt wrong. Why hadn't we seen her walk past us, and why would she leave in the middle of a panic attack? Danielle leaned over to me. "I don't like this. Something's not right." Before I could respond, the plane shook again, harder this time. Luggage fell from the overhead compartments, and I heard a faint whisper, low and chilling, coming from the intercom. It wasn't the pilot. "Help us." The whisper sent shivers down my spine. I looked at Amar and Danielle. Their faces mirrored my fear. The other passengers were visibly panicked now, murmuring among themselves. The flight attendant reappeared, but something was different. Her pale skin now looked almost translucent, and her eyes were completely black. She walked slowly down the aisle, stopping at each row to stare at the passengers. When she reached us, she tilted her head and smiled. "Would you like something to drink?" "No," Daniel stammered, his voice barely audible. Her smile widened unnaturally. And sometimes we watch movies. Done Jump Station, and you familiar with the slow movements. They need to be scared. We're thousands of feet in the air. Suddenly, the plane's engines sputtered and the cabin lights went out completely. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the cabin, and the whispers grew louder. I could barely make out the other passengers, but I saw shapes, shadowy figures moving in the darkness. They weren't human. One of them stopped near our row. Its glowing red hand paused at us. A growl rose in my throat as it reached out a clawed hand. Daniel grabbed my arm, pulling me away just in time. "We need to get to the cockpit," he shouted. The three of us stumbled through the chaos, dodging the shadowy figures that now filled the cabin. Passengers screamed, but their voices were quickly silenced. When we reached the cockpit door, it was locked. Danielle pounded on it desperately. "Open up! Let us in!" The door creaked open slowly, and we pushed our way inside. The cockpit was empty. The controls blinked erratically, and the windows revealed nothing but a swirling void of darkness. "What's happening?" Amar cried. Before I could answer, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The last thing I remember is the sensation of falling, a free fall into the abyss. When I woke up, I was lying on a beach. The sun was shining, and the waves lapped gently at the shore. Danielle and Amar were next to me, unconscious but alive. The plane was gone. To this day, I don't know what happened on that flight. We've never talked about it. Some nights, I hear the whispers in my dreams calling me back to the void. And I wonder, does it real, or are we still falling? As the waves crashed gently against the shore, I sat there, my mind racing. How had we survived? Where was everyone else? And what was that thing on the plane? Danielle groaned and stirred beside me. "Where? Danielle, don't get stressed. We mustn't fly back to Australia or anywhere else if we don't." But the plane didn't connect. It's gone. Amar sat up next, rubbing his head. His usually confident face was pale, his eyes darting around the deserted beach. This isn't where we were supposed to land," he muttered. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions, with dense jungle looming just beyond the sand. The sky was an unnatural shade of gray, with no sun visible, though the light was bright enough to see clearly. It felt wrong, like we had stepped into a world that wasn't ours. Daniel asked suddenly. We all froze. In the distance, faint whispers carried on the wind. They sounded eerily similar to the ones we'd heard on the plane. "No," I said firmly, trying to shake off the fear. "It's just the wind." Amar stood up, brushing sand off his clothes. "We need to find help. Maybe other survivors washed up somewhere nearby." None of us wanted to venture into the jungle, but staying on the beach felt even worse. The whispers seemed to grow louder the longer we stayed. The jungle was thick and humid, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. As we walked, the whispers followed us, seeming to come from all around. Daniel kept glancing over his shoulder, and even Amar, who usually stayed calm, looked shaken. "I don't like this," Daniel said. "This place isn't normal." He was right. The deeper we went, the stranger the jungle became. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches resembling outstretched hands. The ground was littered with bones, animal bones, I hoped. At one point, we stumbled upon a clearing with what looked like wreckage from the plane. A mangled seat, a torn piece of fabric, and a broken tray table were scattered across the ground. "This is impossible," I whispered. The plane wasn't anywhere near the beach. Amar picked up a piece of metal. His hands trembled. Maybe the explosion scattered the debris?" Daniel shook his head. "There was no explosion. We didn't crash, Amar. We fell into something, a place we weren't meant to be." As if on cue, the whispers grew louder, and the jungle seemed to close in around us. The trees swayed despite the absence of wind, and shadows darted between them. "We need to go," I said, "now." We turned to leave, but the path we'd taken had vanished. The jungle was shifting, rearranging itself to trap us. "Stick together," Amar said, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. We stumbled through the dense foliage, every step feeling like a battle against the unseen force that seemed to be watching us. The shadows grew bolder, moving closer, their shapes taking on forms that defied logic. Finally, we broke through the trees and into another clearing. This one was different. In the center stood a massive structure, a crumbling stone temple covered in vines, symbols that made my skin crawl just looking at them. "We shouldn't be here," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. Amar took a hesitant step forward. "If we can figure out what this place is, maybe we can find a way out." Against every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, I followed them inside. The air inside the temple was freezing, and the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. The whispers were deafening now, but they weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, and they were speaking to us. "Welcome," they said in unison, their tone neither friendly nor hostile. "You shouldn't have come. We didn't mean to," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. "We just want to go home." The voices laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made my blood run cold. "There is no home for you now. You crossed the threshold. You belong to us." Amar stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We don't belong to anyone. Let us go." The light from the walls grew brighter, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. Shadows rose from the floor, forming into towering figures with glowing red eyes. "You can leave," one of the figures said, "but only one of you." "What?" Danielle gasped. The shadow smiled, its teeth gleaming like shards of glass. "A sacrifice must be made. One stays, so the others can go." "No way," I said, shaking my head. "We're not leaving anyone behind." The shadows moved closer, their forms twisting and shifting. "You don't have a choice." We backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The temple walls began to close in, and the figures loomed over us, waiting for their decision. "What do we do?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. None of us answered. The weight of the choice crushed us. Finally, Amar stepped forward, his head held high. "Take me," he said. "Let them go." "No!" Daniel and I shouted at the same time, grabbing his arms. "You have a family," Amar said, looking at me. "And Daniel has his little sister. I can't let you stay here." Before we could stop him, the shadows engulfed Amar, pulling him into the darkness. His scream echoed through the temple, and then... Hey. Silence. He screamed for days, calling his name, hoping against hope that he'd come back, but he never did. To this day, I can't forget the sound of his scream or the look in his eyes as he sacrificed himself for us. We were Scone, too. I stopped to tell me a story, and every now and then, when the wind is still and the night is quiet, I hear the whispers again. They remind me that the jungle, the temple, and the shadows are still out there, waiting